The year's 1961 within the prestigious walls of Yale University. Ordinary people, mail carriers, teachers, engineers, arrive at the quiet academic laboratories. They have responded to a modest ad in a local newspaper promising $4.50, equivalent to about $45 today, for an hour's participation in a scientific study on memory. The sum is not huge, but it's significant. The atmosphere is calm, almost sterile. Nothing suggests that in an hour these individuals will face the most difficult moral choice of their lives. Behind it all is Stanley Milgram. He is not a sinister genius, but a young, ambitious social psychologist. The son of Jewish immigrants deeply affected by the history of the Holocaust, he was a student of the renowned Solomon Asch, who studied conformity. Milgram was haunted by a question that plagued the entire post-war generation: how do entire nations become accomplices to monstrous crimes? He wanted to understand how good, decent people could obey orders that lead to cruelty. The experiment's premise was flawless. Each new participant was asked to draw from a hat to determine their role: teacher or learner. This was an illusion of choice. Both slips of paper were marked teacher. The role of the learner was always played by an actor, a friendly, harmless-looking 47-year-old accountant. The teacher's task sounded simple: read word pairs, and for each mistake the learner made, administer an electric shock, increasing the voltage each time. The centerpiece of the room was the shock generator. It looked imposing and professional, like an instrument panel from a military radio room. A row of 30 switches ranged from 15 volts labeled slight shock to 450 volts marked danger, severe shock, and simply XXX. This was not just a box with buttons. It was a symbol of scientific authority. To ensure the teacher had no doubt about its reality, they received a sample shock themselves, 45 volts, a short, sharp pain that proved this was all real. Meanwhile, thousands of miles from the Yale laboratory, an event was unfolding in Jerusalem. Broadcast to the entire world, the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust. Philosopher Hannah Arendt followed the proceedings closely. Looking at Eichmann, she did not see a demon. She saw an ordinary bureaucrat who would later become the basis for her concept of the banality of evil. Eichmann's primary defense was a phrase that echoed through the courtroom and around the world: "I was only following orders." This was the very argument Stanley Milgram set out to test. His experiment had nothing to do with memory. It was a test of conscience caught in the vice of authority. Milgram, like many others, was confident he knew the answer. He believed that blind, thoughtless obedience was a characteristic of authoritarian cultures, primarily German culture. His plan was simple: conduct the study in the United States to establish a normal baseline for the behavior of free people, then travel to Germany to prove his theory by contrast. Milgram was like an epidemiologist developing a test for an exotic virus to use in a distant land, only to discover with horror that half of his own neighbors were already infected. The results obtained in New Haven, Connecticut were so staggering that the trip to Germany became meaningless. How far did reality diverge from expectations? Before the experiment began, Milgram surveyed 40 of his colleagues, psychiatrists at Yale Medical School. These were experts in human behavior. They were asked to predict how many teachers would go all the way to the end of the shock scale. Their verdict was nearly unanimous: only a tiny fraction, about 1 in 1,000, pathological sadists. The exception that proves the rule. The experiment begins, the first mistakes, the first clicks of the switches. 15 volts, 30, 45. At first, the teacher is calm, simply following instructions, perhaps even with a slight smirk. At 75 volts, a grunt of pain is heard from the other side of the wall, a moment of hesitation, but nothing serious. At 120 volts, a clear shout, "Hey, that really hurts!" At 135 volts, agonizing, prolonged groans. At this moment, the game is over. For the teacher, reality sets in. A reality in which they are voluntarily inflicting suffering on another person. Their gaze darts around the room and lands on a figure in a white lab coat, the experimenter. Not a gray-haired professor, but a 31-year-old high school biology teacher, specifically hired and instructed to maintain a cool, business-like demeanor. He is neither malicious nor kind. He is detached, like a mechanic listening to an engine without thinking about the driver. When the teacher hesitates, he delivers one of 4 pre-scripted prods, increasing in intensity from a gentle, "Please continue," to an absolute, "You have no other choice, you must go on." These are not threats, they are appeals to duty, to the contract, to science, and they prove to be remarkably effective. The drama intensifies with each click. At 150 volts, the learner screams that he has a heart condition and demands to be released immediately. At 300 volts, he pounds desperately on the wall and then falls silent. The teachers enter a state of extreme internal conflict. They sweat, tremble, bite their lips, dig their fingernails into their palms, and argue with the experimenter. One of them, a 46-year-old encyclopedia salesman, begins to laugh so hard and nervously that he suffers a full-blown seizure. The experiment is stopped for him. He could not continue, but most did. The climax arrives in silence. After 330 volts, not a sound comes from the learner's room. A complete, deafening silence. The screams were terrible, but the silence was unbearable. It was like a sudden loss of contact with an astronaut on a spacewalk. It shifted the entire burden of interpretation onto the teacher. Was he alive in there, or had they just killed a man? The experimenter calmly explains that a lack of response should be treated as an incorrect answer. The next button must be pressed. And even in the face of this terrifying uncertainty with a human life potentially at stake, many pressed it. The statistics were stark but stunning. In the baseline version of the experiment, the one conducted within the walls of Yale, 65% of participants, 26 out of 40 people, went all the way to the end of the scale, all the way to the lethal 450 volts. This was not 1 in 1,000, as the experts had predicted. It was 2 out of 3. Just imagine 3 of your friends or colleagues. Milgram's statistics suggest that 2 of them, placed in that room, would have obeyed orders to the very end. Not sadists, ordinary citizens of New Haven. To explain this shocking result, Milgram introduced the concept of the agentic state. He theorized that within a hierarchical structure, under the pressure of authority, a person ceases to see themselves as the author of their own actions and becomes an instrument. A simple analogy Milgram himself used was a hammer in a carpenter's hand. Moral responsibility lies not with the hammer, but with the one who wields it. In the same way, the teacher mentally transferred all responsibility to the figure in the white lab coat, and their own conscience fell silent. The power of this situation was proven by numerous variations of the experiment. When the learner was in the same room as the teacher, not behind a wall, the obedience rate dropped to 40%. When the teacher had to physically force the learner's hand onto the shock plate, only 30% went to the end. It's like warfare. It's one thing to press a button to launch a missile from hundreds of miles away, and quite another to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Physical proximity to the victim's suffering proved to be a powerful moral safeguard, but an even more critical factor was authority itself. When Milgram removed the prestigious mantle of Yale University and conducted the experiment in a modest rented office under the name of a fictional research associates, obedience fell to 48%. When the experimenter gave orders over the phone instead of standing nearby, it plummeted to 21%. But the most telling result came when 2 other teachers, who were actually actors, were in the room. At a certain point, they would defiantly refuse to continue. In that situation, only 10% of the real participants went all the way. The example of disobedience from one's peers proved to be the most potent antidote to blind obedience. For each participant, however, the story didn't end with the final click of a switch. Milgram considered the debriefing phase to be critically important. Immediately after the experiment, a door would open and the learner would walk in, alive and unharmed, smiling and shaking the hand of his tormentor. This was the moment of truth. The initial reaction for nearly everyone was the same, a wave of immense, almost hysterical relief. But that was followed by something more complex: shame, confusion, and the shock of realizing what they had just been capable of. It was a painful, but, as Milgram believed, necessary lesson. The scientific community, however, saw it not as a lesson, but as torture. Milgram was hit by a firestorm of fierce criticism. Colleagues accused him of unethical deception and of inflicting severe psychological trauma on his participants. The voice of this outrage was psychologist Diana Baumrind. In 1964, she published a scathing article arguing that Milgram had demeaned his subjects, forcing them to confront their own dark potential and leaving them with damaged trust in authority. The consequences were real. The American Psychological Association suspended his membership for a year, and the experiment became a textbook example of how not to conduct research. It was the catalyst for creating strict ethical codes to protect participants. But there was another side to the story that critics preferred to ignore. A year later, Milgram sent a follow-up questionnaire to all participants. The results were astounding. 84% said they were glad to have participated. 74% reported that they had learned an important lesson about themselves and society that they would not have learned otherwise. Many wrote him personal letters of gratitude. One participant put it this way: "While I was believing that I was causing pain to another person, I was in no way enjoying it." Few people ever have the opportunity to find out something about themselves under such conditions. His words raise a difficult question that still has no answer. Can temporary stress and deception be justified for the sake of such profound and vital knowledge about human nature? That question was left hanging, but history, unfortunately, was already providing its own brutal answers. Milgram's findings ceased to be an academic theory when the world saw the photographs from the Vietnamese village of My Lai or the Iraqi prison of Abu Ghraib. Private Lindy England, whose smiling face next to abused prisoners became a symbol of that horror, stated at her trial that she was just following instructions from people in authority. It was an almost verbatim description of the agentic state. Milgram's experiment didn't predict these events, it gave us a language to understand them. But the Yale laboratory proved to be a model not just for the military barracks. Its ghost also appeared in the gleaming skyscrapers of corporations. Consider the Volkswagen emission scandal, where engineers knowingly deceived regulators for years, or the financial fraud at Enron. Here, the lab coat was replaced by an expensive business suit, and the command, "The experiment requires that you continue," became the impersonal, "We must meet our quarterly targets at any cost." These were not monsters. They were brilliant professionals, obediently following orders within a rigid corporate hierarchy. Today, authority has become even more elusive. Who is this person in the white lab coat in the age of social media? Perhaps it is an impersonal algorithm that decides what we see in our feeds. Its command is quiet but insistent. The algorithm requires that you continue scrolling and engaging. And the shock generator is now the share button, capable of spreading hatred or lies with a single click, causing very real pain. Milgram's experiment has not become obsolete. It has merely changed its setting, proving that the most dangerous order is the one we obey without even noticing it. And yet, the main, most important conclusion of the Milgram experiment is not that a hidden monster resides within each of us. It is that evil is typically banal, born not of hatred, but of obedience. As Milgram himself wrote, "Often it is not so much the kind of person a man is as the kind of situation in which he finds himself that determines how he will act." This is a story about the incredible power of context, about how it can compel the most ordinary, decent people to commit acts that completely contradict their conscience. But this also reveals the second, equally important side of the discovery. If a situation can compel obedience, it can also inspire resistance. We talk too much about the 65% who obeyed, but the true heroes of this story are the 35%, those who said no. They were not just statistics. They were people who argued with the experimenter, appealed to his conscience, and ultimately simply got up and walked out. The example of just one such person, as we recall, was enough to break the spell of authority for everyone else. And so, 60 years later, it is easy to judge those who sat and pressed the buttons. But the Milgram experiment is not a historical artifact. It is a mirror, a perpetual moral stress test for humanity. It does not ask whether they were good or bad people. It asks each of us an eternal and uncomfortable question: what would you have done in their place? Where is your line? And will you have the courage to defend it when an authority in a white lab coat or an expensive suit orders you to cross it?